Hey everyone, it is Cam or Jonah here from the Daily Cross, and today we have a great interview today, and I'm so excited about this. But we are continuing our Why You Should Be series, which is where we look at different Orthodox Christian traditions, and we discuss them, and I get some opinions from someone who's in the tradition of why you might want to check this one out at the very least, or become it full sale. So today we have Joshua on the channel for Methodism. How are you today, Josh?
I am good. Tired
Yeah.
after a long day of work, but that's how we are here.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I think both of us have to get up like in like only a few hours.
It's just 3:30 a.m. No big deal.
Mine's similar, so we love that. Uh, so yeah, I guess we'll just get into. Well, first off, I'll mention right off the bat, just because I forgot to with Adam's interview. Josh does have a YouTube channel, and we'll get into that a little bit. But Practical Christian Lessons, great channel, check it out. But we'll get into that, I'm sure, a little later, and that will be linked in the description. So, all right, let's just get into the questions. What is Methodism, and where does it come from?
So I'm gonna read from books, because if you go to my channel, that's all I do is read from books. It's not true, but it's mostly true. I guess I need to start back one page. Wesley's own personal pilgrimage of faith is, of course, centrally and inextricably intertwined with the development of theology, the organization, and the mission of Methodism in the 18th century. But his is neither the only nor the whole story. Many of the ideas that he incorporated into Methodism came from other people. Many of the activities that characterized the movement were started by other persons. And although Wesley kept a close personal control of the movement, not everyone responded positively to his direction. The story of the Wesleyan movement in the 18th century is the story of Wesley and the people called Methodists. And that's from Wesley and the people called Methodists. This was the standard textbook on Methodist history. And these two quotes will make sense once I start talking. I just need to lay the background first here. I promise.
Yeah,
It'll make sense.
Yeah.
Is there any single force which gives direction to the entire Methodist tradition? Probably not, considering the many complex factors which enter into the making of so large a movement. Some main lines, however, become clear as the pieces are sorted. These lines will become the guiding channels for understanding this history. Whether any one line becomes the determining channel for understanding the whole belongs properly to the conclusion, perhaps even more properly to speculation about the course of the future. This is from the Story of American Methodism, which I haven't read fully yet, but from what I have read, it's not too bad. And the reason those two things matter is because often when you hear about Methodism, you hear about John Wesley, that it was founded by John Wesley. It is the John Wesley movement. And he's absolutely our patriarchal figurehead here. And that's for all Methodists. My experience is with American Methodists. So to everyone listening, if you're Methodist from outside of America, I do not have experience there. I can't speak to it. But it was far more than just John Wesley and in the Oxford movement when it started. Charles Wesley, perhaps I've met some people who didn't even know Charles Wesley existed until I said his name, which is really sad. He's one of the big figures in Methodism. He was a famous hymn writer, still is a famous hymn writer in both the Anglican and the Methodist tradition. And it's often said that Methodism was born in music, and that's not too far off. His hymns were just full of rich theology, and they were both sort of like icons in the early church that were not venerated. They were just there. One of the uses was education, and his music was very much the same way for that. For people who can read, this was something easy they could sing every week and come and memorize. And it was also, of course, huge for the formation of praise and worship within the Methodist tradition as time went on. But when you look back at the roots of John Wesley, they were called the Bible Moss and the Holy Club and tons of names in Oxford. He wasn't really the one who started the little Holy Club. That was someone else. And he, of course, took it and expanded it as time went on and grew it. But that's sort of, as Heitzenrater notes in the people called Methodists, that is the trajectory of Methodism, is all these different influences from John Wesley's life, whether that's his mother or his father or the Puritans or the Moravians or Anglicans, tons of influences. He just took tons of practices and adapted them to specific scenarios. And out of that, Methodism eventually came to be what was a very huge denomination and is now many more smaller denominations around the world.
Yeah.
Just in America, you had the UMC. They're gone now. You have the GMC forming. There's the Bible Methodist. There's the Wesleyan Methodist. There's the Free Methodist and the World Association of Methodists. There's tons of just small Methodist groups. But that comes from a very convoluted history of when the American Methodist formed, we kind of split off from the English Methodist. It was an unfortunate part of, I'd say, a combination of things. Right after the American Revolution, John Wesley underestimated how fiercely independent the American Methodists were. And I have statues. The one on the horse is Francis Asbury, and the other one is John Wesley. Francis Asbury famously said, "John Wesley is Caesar and I'm Pompey, because I will have no greater and he will have no equal." And that describes the relationship pretty well between the American and the English Methodist before the unfortunate split. But if anyone wants modern voices, and hopefully I'll have a playlist together on my channel for it, I'd recommend Kenneth Collins as a good YouTube sort of playlist over John Wesley and his influence in the Methodist tradition specifically. If you prefer books, this is where you start. Wesley and the People Called Methodist Heitzenrater.
Okay. Yeah, well, definitely have to put that in the description for people to go to. Yeah, and I didn't really know about much of the American split from English. I don't know. I feel like Methodism is another denomination where it's very much like Lutheranism. Like, I know there's very like people were like, oh, it was started by Martin Luther, but it's actually he might have spearheaded it, like John Wesley with the Methodists, but really it's like he brought a ton of people together in common thinking that it was already happening for a while, but just he was the one voice that was like super open about it, so he popularizes it.
I'm gonna steal Adam's line and say we were founded by Jesus Christ first, and then down the line it came, the Methodism movement came out of the call for revival. And really all of Christendom at that time was really bad, but England was pretty brutal. It was not a good spot to be if you were a Christian.
And and I know there's definitely some similarities with like Anglicanism too, of like that gets misconstrued too. But also, I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to a little bit too, and this kind of goes into the next question as well. But like the relationship between Methodist and Anglican, I know is an interesting one.
So of course, despite what some Methodists want to claim, unfortunately, in our modern time, there's a ton of influence from Anglicanism. Luckily, Kenneth Collins has started doing some work on that exact subject in our modern time. So I'm hopeful to see where that goes. But much like our ancestral roots, we're sort of a via media between, let's go with the high church and the low church crowd. We're kind of in between those two things a lot of the times. I tend to think, though it wasn't the case when it first started, it became the case over time, at least from what I've read so far, in American Methodism, is the focus on liturgy never really went away, but it became far less of the focus. And I think that stems from, Wesley took the 39 articles and gave us the 24 articles. The Americans eventually added one more. He took the Book of Common Prayer and made it the Sunday service book, which is like a much smaller thing, and isn't even used in a lot of places nowadays. We have the hymnal now, which has orders and an order of service in it, but it's not anywhere close to even what the Sunday service book was, which is really sad because I love the Book of Common Prayer.
And I know John Wesley, from what I've heard, had a very special place in his heart for the BCP. Especially.
The only reason he simplified and edited things down was because he was making it specifically for people that were, as he would call it, the common folk. He this was something that the Americans could use regardless of if they were someone out on the frontier and expanding or someone farming in the local town. That was kind of his huge main concern.
I do see that. That is my kind of fascination, though I haven't gotten into it too much. That has been my fascination with Methodism specifically, because they've been very influential in like a lot of the culture. I see a lot more. Like I see them popping up in history, preaching the gospel more than some other denominations.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Methodism's focus on holiness and discipleship has been
yeah,
a consistent and staying motivation for it.
yeah, yeah, and that kind of leads us into the Anglican discussion. Kind of leads us into second question: where is Methodism in relation to other religions? Of course, but
Yeah.
which is an easier question, I think. But but denominations as well.
I like to describe us as the middle ground between the Lutherans and the Reformed.
Okay, interesting.
Where Anglicans, you kind of get what you'll call Arminians and Reformed sort of like existing in the same group. Methodist had that historically, but quickly phased out.
Mm,
And that stems in large part, that really stems to soteriology because, and I guess ecclesiology, study of school and study of salvation. Because when with the Reformed debates, you had the Arminian side come out and Dort came out, and the Arminians were forced out of the Reformed tradition for rejecting unconditional election, double predestination, and all that. And then you get Arminians and Reformed in the Anglican Church after that. Lutherans are like the other end of the, let's say, shall we say, of like they still believe in a unconditional election but not double predestination.
mm,
And then you get Arminians in the middle who disagree with both sides, as I like to say, and agree with
mm,
both sides on a fair amount.
yeah.
And that's what really influenced Wesley, was that specific Arminian strand, and became the norm for Methodist post, during and post Wesley. He had some pretty biting words on the specific Calvinist understanding of predestination. He simmered,
Sure.
he calmed down when he got older, but you can
Yeah.
tell when he was younger and he was very full of fire.
Well,
Um,
and that's kind of, I feel like that's different than a lot of the
yeah,
a lot of the theologians I know.
yeah,
They get a little
yeah,
bit more heated as they get older. They get a bit
yeah.
more grumpy.
He still had his bite, but luckily he did calm down as he got older. And part of that was definitely his friendship with George Whitefield, who was a very strong
Mm,
Calvinist, who also had equally biting words to get back to Wesley. It was very tense in their relationship for a while.
yeah.
But so we kind of fall in the middle there. And then on ecclesiology, right, we don't say that, as you'll find in part of the Anglican tradition, not all of it now, but like the necessity of a bishopric is not something
Mm,
you'll hear about a lot nowadays, where of course many Methodists support and want a bishopric. I'm one of them. I think we should keep the bishopric in the GMC as it goes forward. Whether or not they will, we'll find out.
mhm,
I know their current plan is to, but they're making changes to it that I would rather they didn't.
mhm.
But then you also have like the Free Methodist and the Bible Methodist. I think the Wesleyan Methodist are too, but I'm not certain. They're more congregational in their structure.
Mhm.
So you have kind of built into Methodism, you get the episcopacy of Anglicanism and then the congregational models of the Reformed churches.
Mhm.
And then we just kind of sit there in the middle.
Yeah.
Um, and
And
then in another way, in like the modern evangelical world, I call us middle church because
yeah, yeah.
yeah, if your term's high church in terms of sacraments and liturgy, we do hit those marks. But if your term for high and low church is worship style, which is what
Mhm.
most people mean, um, you still get a fair amount of like Methodists who use the old hymns, which I love. I love the old hymns. They still wear robes and
Mhm.
have a fair amount of liturgy. But then you also have a lot of places that are doing more contemporary music.
Yeah.
So not quite burning incense and marching across down, but also not quite the
Yeah,
sacraments don't do anything
yeah.
and we're just memorialist. So we
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
fall in between those two things. When you get called too Catholic by one side and not Catholic
Yes.
enough by the other, just like Adam said, you're probably in a good spot.
Yes. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, and that's kind of where we're starting is with historical kind of Protestant branches, and I feel like that's what happens a lot is
Yeah.
you're a little too Catholic for me, but also you're not Catholic enough for me, you know.
Yeah.
So I get that, and it's I think it's very interesting, and I had to think about that personally of the Via Media claim for Methodism because I always see it as Lutherans kind of think of that way. Some Lutherans, anyways, of like between Reformed and Arminian or Calvinist and Arminian.
I mean, it could go both ways.
Yeah, yeah,
To be
yeah.
fair, yeah,
Yeah, and you know, with Anglican, obviously, they 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 would say that because of how they're structured. But yeah,
yeah.
that's very interesting. That's I will definitely have to think about that a bit more.
We're all the
Um,
Via Media.
we are all the Via Media. Yeah, I mean, historical Protestantism is pretty via media, I think, of
Yeah.
the whole Catholic Church. But anyways, what? So, and this will go back into this. What makes Methodism distinct?
This is where it gets really weird because theologically we're not very distinct. We're not that like if you think of Anglicans, you're not that far off. If you're familiar with theology, not that far off from Methodism. One of the few distinct things is, do I have the book? No, I packed the book up. I'm in the middle of moving, so this bookshelf will look different than some videos you find on my channel. But Perfect Love by Kevin Watson talks about the doctrine. You'll hear it in a lot of titles. I think there's like 6 or 7 that are commonly used. Entire Sanctification and Christian Perfection are 2 of the more common ones people might be aware of. Kevin Watson calls it Perfect Love. I like Ryan Reeves the best. He calls it Christian Victory. But not even all Methodists hold to that anymore, nor did they in John Wesley's time. And that's just a sort of doctrine that you can be filled with the love of God and love of neighbor so much that that is what motivates every decision you do, and teaches sort of victory over sin. But then you get the confusing part where John Wesley, and he points to scripture for this, where he says even a babe can have victory. A babe in Christ can have victory over sin, right? That we have power over sin. So John Wesley was very good at muddying the waters on his own things. But the other thing that really sets us apart, I would argue, is our extreme focus on holiness and the pursuit of holiness, and the focus on the power of God's grace. I like to call it the optimism of God's grace. That wherever he is working, and that there will be a focus on all the means of grace in the community, at least for the Methodist. And that directly ties into our doctrine of like, how much victory can we have over sin in this life rather than in the next life. And that is purely in the optimism of the power of grace through the Holy Spirit. And that's one of the few things we'll have more than any other tradition, is we think that God's grace does go further in this life than a lot of other traditions. Not that I'm saying anyone doesn't pursue holiness and say that God's grace is all powerful and can do amazing things.
Of course.
But we do it in a way that tends to go a bit overboard compared to some of the other ones.
Yeah, and that is an interesting interesting point, because I do see that with Methodists. I think of like people who are outside of Methodism. When you describe Methodism, they bring up Arminianism, and they bring up some other like more distinct doctrines. But from what I hear from Methodists, it's not, maybe not that that's not believed, but it's not the defining feature. It is more so like the way in which you carry yourself, which I think, which I appreciate very much.
Yeah, that's one of my big draws. And we have a lot of Methodists historically and today who just still aren't Arminians. Like I know a guy, he just calls himself Reformed, and he may not be a 5-point Calvinist, but he's like at least a 3, if not 4. And then Matthew Pinson is just like a Reformed Arminians. I'm like, it feels like a bit of an oxymoron, but
that is interesting, because I see that very much, and it makes sense, because I feel the other denomination that does that the most would be like Anglicanism, and of course Methodism and Anglicanism have tangoed a bit. So
brother and sister.
And I think that's an odd, because I don't see that happen as much with other denominations, if that makes sense. Like when you're like, oh, Lutherans are very distinct with their doctrine. Oh, Reformed are very distinct with their doctrine. Then you talk to a Reformed person or a Lutheran, and they're like, yes, we are. but with I just see with Methodists where it's just like, oh, they believe this, and this is distinct about the Methodist tradition, and the Methodist is just like, it's more about holiness and about walking so I think that's very interesting how that kind of shapes out, because I don't see that happen other places. And this goes in the next one. What is Arminianism, and how does it work with sola fide?
So you hear a lot about Arminianism in the public sphere. I certainly have heard my fair share. I made an Arminian bingo card for all the terrible things you hear on the internet. But Arminianism itself is just really a specific understanding of predestination and God's sovereignty. It's not a full theological system, as some people seem to think it is. It's not, we reject predestination and hold to free will. That's like saying Reformed reject free will. It's just not a true statement. Some people may go to extremes in the modern world. I would just call those people heretics, but not everyone's going to be so blunt about it. But I'd argue the Arminian view especially is one of the early views in the church, and that's always been the argument of Arminianism and Wesleyanism, is that we're very much a stream from the early church to the modern day. But a fair amount of the early church also just said, man, God is sovereign, man has free will, mystery. And I think we probably should have stuck with that answer, but we didn't. Here we are. With sola fide, as far as I'm aware, we're just in line with the ancient church and sola fide. Where it gets weird is you get Arminians who, I've heard 3 terms: synergism, which of course people immediately go to like Pelagians and semi-Pelagians, which is not what we mean. You'll get Roger E. Olson will use the term like evangelical Arminian or evangelical synergist, I think is the phrase he used in his book that's right here behind me on the bookshelf. You get conditional monergist or particular monergist, where it's like conditionally monergistic. And then I would just use the term monergism, because when John Wesley and Jacob Arminius talked about it, they never used the word synergism. It wasn't a term they used. They talked about it in the same way as everyone else. So it just seems like something I wouldn't personally want to use, but I'm also not going to like throw a big stink about an Arminian. As long as I know that they have correct doctrine behind what they're saying, I'm not going to throw a big stink about the exact title they're using. Yeah. But we fully affirm salvation by faith through grace. And where I hear the big objection, especially from Reformed camps, because I don't really hear it from anyone else, just the Reformed camp, only the Reformed. Maybe that just goes back to the bad blood between Arminians and Reformed. I don't know. Is that because we say you can reject the gift of faith, that somehow turns it into a work, which everyone I've ever talked to who's not Reformed says that's insane. And I will go with them. But the analogy Jacob Arminius used is in a beggar taking alms. Right, a beggar doesn't work to receive an alms from someone. All he does is hold out his hand and accept the gift. So how can we say that's work? Whereas some people will tell me, no, he's working to earn that alm by lifting up his hand. And I just look at them like they're crazy. But having watched Adam's video today, also, he brought up the Eucharist, right? You don't work to take the Eucharist, but you have to get in your car and drive to church and walk down the aisle and take it. Yeah. I've used the example of baptism, which is, compared to Israel walking through the Red Sea. I'm like, if those aren't considered the work of the people to earn them anything, I don't see how the Arminian understanding of you can reject the gift of faith really is that much of a difference, if any difference at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it would, man. I'd love to get a discussion going maybe in the future about the difference between Lutheranism and maybe Arminianism, like maybe the nuance there. So I would a lot of people
also love that.
Yes. Maybe that will be something in the future. But yes, that is very interesting, because it is that is a debate that happens a lot. I know I've been debating some people that I love about whether baptism is actually a work. But I do agree with you in that it's not really of us at all.
Yeah.
And I think we would all agree that in historical Protestantism, but I think that's some good groundwork, I guess, for that question. At least trying to bridge the gap with Reformed, and I know Reformed can go awfully hard on different denominations, which we will have them on soon, actually, and with Brother Luke.
There are a lot of really great ones out there who are not quite so combative as you'll find on.
Yes.
Don't base your experience with any tradition with people you interact with on the internet. PSA for the day.
Yes, that's a good takeaway for this whole interview. If you get one thing out of that, yes. But all right. So going on from that, in what ways do you hope Methodism grows? And you talked about, and this is probably really good, just because of recent events and everything. We'll get into that again. But you said you can only speak to kind of American Methodism, which is a big question right now. So yeah.
We're in a really weird spot. I first went to lay out, as much as I will bash on the United Methodist nowadays, that there are still absolutely some churches still there within the UMC, whether they're stuck or whether they're holding out for hope that repentance and change will come back. Because there are a bunch of centrists who, and I don't blame them, thought it would be worse to leave than stay. And I have mad respect for them for willing to stay and go through everything that they're going to have to go through. That being said, the United Methodist, I would say, are now as an official organization, no longer even Christian. So that leaves the rest of the Methodists who left the United Methodist in a really weird spot. We're in our own Reformation. We're returning to our John Wesley roots and going through a revival and Reformation time of our own. But that puts us in a really weird spot because you have the global Methodist forming, which is intention-wise way bigger than just America. So that's going to be something, though the United Methodists were always an international organization, it was always very America-focused. And this is where the power was. This was where the money was. This is where the influence was. So this is where a lot of the stuff just happened. The global Methodists are already intentionally pushing against that. Their first big annual conference is going to be is it Puerto Rico? It's going to be down south of the border. It's international. It's out of America, which is already a huge change. There's already huge focuses on the African church, which I think is really good. Christianity's exploding in Africa. We really need to do a lot of work there. But that leaves the question of, well, how do we interact with the Methodist groups that were already established that weren't in the United Methodist? How does that work with how we're going to form our own theology? Because now we're in that state of, do we keep a bishopric? Do we keep our views on the sacraments? Do we keep X, Y, and Z? What is it that actually makes a Methodist doctrinally a Methodist? Because we're realizing from our past mistakes, one of the reasons the United Methodists went so far astray, other than abandoning the gospel to pursue things that are noble causes, but without the gospel achieve nothing, was letting people just ignore all the standards of theology. Or the confessional standards for the Methodist tradition. So it's like, all right, what are our confessional standards? What are we returning to? And my hope is that how it grows, before it can grow in actual number, we need to return and grow in our doctrinal roots. So for me, that's going to be, I'm not just going to say return to the 25 articles, which I have behind me, this little booklet here. I'm going to say go back to the 39 articles. Let's look at the Book of Common Prayer again. Let's see what John Wesley changed and why, and evaluate it from there.
I was going to say, I have my...
Let's hold up our Book of Common Prayer.
I know. I just got this, so I want to show it off. It's the 2019 version. Aiden, who we had on before this, recommended it, and I finally got it. So
that is a lot nicer than my 2019 one.
you need to get it. I'm just telling you, it's so beautiful. Anyways,
I get it. I'll show off. I got this one.
Oh, nice.
That was a great birthday gift. But I also want to push to go even further back than just the Church of England, right? If the Arminian tradition, though, has a very convoluted history, Jacob Arminius' theology absolutely has a lot of influence on us. John Wesley took the Westminster Catechism and revised it. We have a lot of Reformed influence. We have a lot of influence from that specific period. We should go back to there. And we should do what figures like Thomas Theoden did and go back to the early church and say, hey, we need to go so far back to the beginning and follow that stream of theology that has impacted us and find out what is good and keep that and find out where we went wrong and make sure that doesn't happen again. Because you have the classic thing of people overcorrecting. Yeah. So my hope is that the growth that happens here is we return to more robust liturgy, right? At the very least, bring a Sunday service book back, get on a lectionary plan for the entire church, get everyone reading the same scriptures, focusing on the same things, getting in the same rhythm, especially as an international church is going to be so important for the GMC. It's not like here in America where we're already kind of individualistic and very central, like focus on our own little group. When you're working with any organization that big, you need ways to keep everyone on the same rhythm. And something like the Book of Common Prayer with a set liturgical calendar and a set lectionary can be a big help for that. Yeah.
And I will say, not because I bring this up because I know Methodism is in a hole, but I think that's in a rut, I should say, in America. But I think it's really just Christendom in America.
Yeah, we're in a rough spot.
Unfortunately. So, but I do see hope. I mean, I will say I see that with other traditions too, and I
Yeah,
see a lot
we're
of
all struggling.
bridges being made. I see a lot of
Yeah,
people burning bridges down too, being very cagey. But I do see a lot of people trying to say, hold on,
yeah,
maybe our denominational differences aren't so divisive.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you
I
know,
foresee the problems that are going to arise for the church in the West is going to actually strengthen it. It's going to weed out a bunch of people who are like nominal Christians. The only people left will be those who have a strong faith or want to pursue a strong faith. And as happens often in church history, when the church is at its worst, as far as the world can tell, is like when the church really gets going. There's more church unity than in other times in history. When the church is
yeah,
facing conflict and struggle, it brings people together. And that's why like places like Africa and Asia, like I look to those places, I
mhm,
can't help but smile and have so much hope for the
yeah,
future of the church because they're just huge. And just look at
yeah,
what's going on over there. Like they're going through way worse than we are, and they're
yeah,
just exploding.
yeah. And I hope that happens. I mean, in some way, obviously,
Yeah.
you don't hope for it, but at the same time, you do it for America, where you hope that maybe we can. I mean, I'm very hopeful that historical Protestantism, at the very least, can come together a bit more.
Yeah.
At least in the American context of being like, hey, now that we're all struggling together and everyone's attacking, like let's see what the truth of orthodoxy is here.
Yeah.
Um, so going on from that, uh, why are you Methodist?
Funnily, though, I completely agree with like if you're holding close to the confessional standards, you follow that train of Wesleyan and Arminian and early church thought, then of course I think it's very theologically sound and is the closest to the scriptures. Otherwise, I wouldn't
Mhm.
be here. But the
Yeah.
focus on pursuing holiness and discipleship, on community and service,
Mhm.
that just that to me feels like when you go through the Sermon on the Mount, if that's not what the Sermon on the Mount is
Yeah.
trying to get you at, if that's not what the 10 commandments was about changing your heart into being a heart of a disciple and pursuing God to be holy as God is holy as he calls us to be. I don't know. That just feels like Christianity to me. And that
Yeah.
just, as soon as I entered into church, and my church is huge. I think we have over 2,000 people, and it never felt big to me. They were right away like, hey, you need to be in community and plugged in. Like now,
Yeah.
this is how you grow in the body of Christ. And I
Yeah.
was just like, this feels like home, and it's
Yeah.
where Vincent's.
Yeah. And I get that sense too from I would say Anglicanism and Methodism, especially just within Christendom, where it's very much about the motion of going forward and living in that, like if the Book of Common Prayer. I
Yeah,
mean, Aiden is I know that hasn't come out yet as we're recording this, my interview with Aiden, but we ended up pretty much just talking about the BCP for an hour, um, for most of it, anyways, at least 90% of it, because I mean, yeah, it's very helpful, I think, for all of Christendom to just be on this kind of method of,
yeah,
of holiness. So yeah, I really do see that, and I hope that the whole church will actually be influenced by that. Um, and this just builds off the other one. How does being Methodist affect you in day to day life?
it funnily, and you would think Methodists are not known for theologians. There's a good reason for that. I'll touch on that here in a minute, but it has really forced me to sit down and be very serious about a lot of things. Has been a huge pushing force behind me,
Mm,
not just in figuring out my own theology, but in sitting down and figuring out what God is calling me to do. What is the job He has created me for here in the church, in the here and now and in the future. And reading through John Wesley and the Church Fathers, because I kind of came into Methodism right after a long period of like severe depression, and I wouldn't even have called myself a Christian at that
mhm.
stage of my life. I wasn't going to church, I wasn't praying, I wasn't reading my Bible. I wasn't just in a bad place. And I got to the point I just had to be like, God, I don't know how I've gotten so far off track, but I got to get back on track, and you're the only one who can do that for me. And from there, Adam and I definitely have talked about this a lot in Striving Side by Side, of like my journey with Eastern Orthodoxy and stuff. And that was really what pushed me into the early church, like studying the early church. And then when I found Methodism via my now wife, she was a Methodist, still a Methodist. We're both still Methodist, of course. And it's just like, who's this John Wesley guy? This seems like a lot of the stuff that really drew me into Eastern Orthodoxy. And it was from there, I was just like, I was forced to face John Wesley's very strong challenge and challenges from like Basil the Great and the other two Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, Nyssa, Athanasius. They were just like, your living a holy life matters, just as you're pursuing the knowledge that the revelation that God gives us also really matters. It's just like, okay, I have to sit down and figure this out and do something with this.
Yeah.
And that has been a huge driving force. And the extent of that has also been learning to recognize where the Spirit is working, not just in my own tradition, but others. And just like, I can't deny that God's working here. So I need to recognize that these people are doing exactly what I'm doing, even if it's not exactly the same way. And God is still working there. I've become a lot more ecumenical in a positive sense since I've become a Methodist.
That's good. Yeah. And just to speak to Eastern Orthodoxy too, I know, like, you bring that up, but I know for like myself and for like Adam, that was another pull that led us to where we are as well. I think dealing with that, and Javier, which maybe I can link that in the description, has great videos on that if you're looking for resources there.
You can grab my interview, throw that in there.
Yeah. Yes. Actually, I forgot about that. Yeah. And I think Luke and Adam both also, and I don't think Aiden's the only one.
No, time to get him on there.
Yeah. He just was boop, boop, boop. All right.
You're done.
It's funny. He doesn't also like know anything about non-denominationalism too, which is hilarious to all of us because everyone has like raised up in that. And then he's just like, what? Anyways, the other night he went, who's Lauren Daigle? Everyone's like, what?
Oh no, he doesn't know.
He doesn't know. Okay, so and that's great. And I think Methodism, again, like Anglicanism as well, but I think Methodist, like the day-to-day life definitely is a huge part of that. It's not just a theology, it's a living. So what are some potentially negative things about Methodism today?
I'd say the biggest negative is also the thing I'm most hopeful for, which is the Reformation movement. In the wake of this UMC split for the GMC. For other Methodists, it doesn't necessarily matter as much. But for those who left the UMC specifically, there's a lot of conversations going on now. And, figures like Daniel Hickson, once he got pushed out of the UMC, he joined the Anglican Church, which to the GMC listening, if we can make the Anglican Methodist Union happen sooner, I'm on board with this. But the GMC's got to get a lot figured out first. Yeah. Or whether, of course, the GMC, or if you want to join one of the other standing Methodist traditions that weren't impacted by the split. So that's got to be very appealing to a lot of people. Like, hey, these like congregational Methodist churches are still around. If I can go get plugged into them, we won't even be dealing with the consequences of the split. But for those in the GMC, and though my church isn't in the GMC, I still want to be very involved in the conversation. Then, of course, the next question is, what is the next step? We're all agreed. You need to focus on God, on the work of the kingdom, on pursuing him. But you have to address, how do we move forward, right? People like me, of course, call for a return to our roots and going all the way back to the early church. But then you have like what's going on with the GMC right now. They're wanting to change how the bishopric works, and that it won't be a lifelong appointment. That'll be more of like, you're there for a season and then you're gone, which I'm very against. But the GMC is going to do what the GMC is going to do. There are people who are even saying like, do we need to push infant baptism? Is that something we need to have to be Methodist? And I can feel every Methodist of our past rolling in their graves just saying that statement out loud. Literally all of them. It's such a huge deal. I I just want to grab some people and shake them and go, yes, of course, that's essential to being.
Yeah.
Just like if you don't want to be a Methodist, you don't have to be. No one's forcing you to be here.
Yeah.
But we're facing the classic pendulum swing of, are we going to do, and this is one of the reasons I'm not Lutheran, as much as I agree with Lutheran soteriology and on a fair amount of theology of like their strictness on the Book of Concord.
Yeah.
Are we going to go to where we're like going to hold everyone to a very large amount of standards? And I don't blame the Lutherans for doing that. That's their beliefs.
Yeah.
And that's all. It has given them a lot of strength.
Yeah.
Whereas we in the middle, and this is also happening in the Anglican world, where we were kind of loose on our confessional standards to the point we suffered serious consequences for it.
Yeah.
So now we all need to evaluate how strict are we going to be, to the other end of tossing the baby, the bathwater, and the bathtub out the window and just throwing everything out. And it's just like these two extremes aren't what we want to do. That's not what Methodism is or has ever been. So we need to really buckle down. And for some people, that's going to be a reason to stay away from Methodism. And that's completely fair. You know, if you're new to the faith, the Methodist Church might not be the place you want to be right now unless you have a good Free Methodist or Bible Methodist or Wesleyan Methodist near you. If all you have is GMC, maybe give them some time to see how they decide what their future looks like. But for those of us who find that exciting, hey, that's great. And that also ties into a very real downside, no matter where you are, and that is the geographic locations of Methodist churches. They tend to really be centered around the same spot, and that just comes from how evangelizing in the Methodist church historically has been done, which has always been, we start with a small group in like a house church. That was always sort of the model for like class and band meetings. And then from there, you just grow. And so you grow in one area until you couldn't grow anymore. You'd have to start somewhere else, but it would be nearby. So that was kind of how it grew. So it'd grow kind of like a flower in small circles. But that meant if you didn't reach this area, there were no Methodists there at all. And that's still super common in the Methodist world, at least here in America.
Yeah.
You have just pockets of large amounts of Methodist churches, and then areas where there's just no Methodist churches at all. Or as a lot of my friends comment, the only Methodists around me now are UMCs flying certain flags outside of their churches. And I'm just like, I'm sorry, but that is a very real downside for Methodism right now. And that might change in the future, but that's where we are now.
Yeah. No, and that's understandable. And it is a really, and again, like I'm hopeful. I strive to be very ecumenical, especially with historical Protestantism, which I would include like the first four in the series, which would be Anglican, Methodist, Lutheran, and Reformed. I think there's a lot of ground. I hope that is the bridges being made in the future, being that I think there's a real foundation there. And that might sound silly to some Reformed people saying that Reformed and Methodists are in the same boat, but I don't know. I'm convinced of that.
Just tell him that John Wesley was correct when he said we're within a hair's breadth, and that the GMC is already talking about joining the Anglicans in some form of union. So come on, Reformed, join us.
Yeah.
Drink the grape juice. No, let's go back to wine, please.
Yeah. Yeah. And as for infants, infant baptism.
Yeah. Big deal.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
So going on from that, what are some misconceptions about Methodism?
Man, where do we start? It's always a tricky question.
Here comes your homily.
Enter homily. It's always tricky, especially with American churches, because it's hard to draw the line when there's a misconception, when there are many groups called Methodists that are the ones who are actually falling into the misconception. So you're like,
yes,
you can point it out and then just be like, oh, no true Scotsman argument. In which case, no true Scotsman. No, I don't do that. But it is true that like Methodists have not been holding to confessional standards. That's just a sad fact that we've had to face, and we're dealing with consequences of that now. Some of the like congregational churches of Methodists don't have that problem. They've been well at maintaining, because they're in their small models. They're not out trying to sort of move with the sway of things. They're just like, no, this is our little confessional pocket, and you agree with it or you don't. We're not going to force you here, but you can't change it. So it's that weird thing of there are a lot of misconceptions about Methodism if you're talking about confessional Methodist who hold to the teachings and the standards versus a lot of people who have the title Methodist and actually are the truth of these misconceptions, and is why it's addressed as the whole. Right, like we aren't all liberal, as many liberal UMC institutions are still around. And when you factor in, like, there are many Arminians in the Methodist tradition, Arminianism also has its fair share of misconceptions. On that, I'm just going to recommend, I don't know if it's popping up in camera, but Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities by Thomas Theoden. And that will go way bigger than just Methodist, but most of the misconceptions I encounter actually stem from Arminianism rather than Methodism. The big Methodist one is that you're all liberals and don't have any confessional standards. And I'm just like, well, that may be true for many Methodists, but that's not true for like. Oh yeah.
And I actually see that a lot with. I mean, and this goes back to your last two episodes. I mean, Anglicanism, where it's just like you can believe whatever you want. It's like, okay, well, the 39 Articles, though, and not Book of Homilies and the Book of Common Prayer. And I see this too with Lutheranism, especially with, like, say, the ELCA in America, where people I know, like, especially like lower church congregations that I know and love, they will be like, oh man, Lutherans are just liberal. I'm like, have you met an actual Lutheran? They are the most, like, strict Book of Concord people ever, and they're just like, no, this is so. I see that happen a lot, especially in America, where some of the mainline churches are straying, unfortunately.
Yeah, just direct them to Rev Perry's channel. Oh, what's it? Christian Combatives, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, he'll be the most combative Lutheran we'll see on the internet.
Yeah, and I'll have to, and we'll go back to Adam's video for all the Lutheran sources.
Yeah, he's got the good stuff.
Yeah, he's also got the I forgot the name, but the book on the Council of Trent.
Chemnitz.
Yeah, Chemnitz. Yep. Chemnitz work on it, which I'm so jealous of.
Me too.
It's gonna be a Christmas gift to myself. I'm just gonna say that right now. It's coming.
Give me a few years.
All right. So this is the last question. This is the big kahuna, if you will. Why should someone be Methodist?
Maybe it's a cheap answer, but I would say the same reason I am, right? If you read the scriptures and walk away saying, I want something that pursues holiness, that pursues discipleship, that pursues community and service, then the Methodist world is for you. If you can find a good confessional Methodist church near you. Right. If you're more of the philosophical type, Reformed's probably the place for you, not Methodist. You're not going to find a lot of philosophers in Methodist. And most of our theologians, and this stems from that focus. And this is one of the reasons I liked it, and was when I figured this out, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense why we're not known for our theologians, though we have a few like Thomas Oden, Thomas Summers, and Richard Watson, Kevin Watson, several others who wrote like systematics or other types of theological works like that. But most of our theologians aren't focused on, hey, this is Wesleyan theology. They're focused on, this is holy living. This is how to be a disciple. This is how to share the gospel. They're focused on very practical things that apply to a ton of just open, I'd say, mere Christianity, and is for the church body as a whole, which is a beautiful thing. I'm like, if that's the reason we don't have a lot of famous theologians, I'm happy with that. That's a great reason to have people just out focusing on serving the body as a whole rather than focusing on our specific theology. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And I think that should be why you join the Methodist. If that is your focus, if that's what you get from seeing the scriptures, and if you think that's where we're in line with it, that's why you should be a Methodist. If you don't agree with us, then don't be a Methodist.
Yeah, I think that's been the big takeaway, at least of the first 3 episodes, where it's like, well, that's what you get from the scriptures. If you don't, then you shouldn't be.
Yeah. Maybe God's calling you somewhere else. Every tradition's got its strength and weaknesses, and you've got your strengths and weaknesses by God's gifts. So He'll plug you in where He needs you. Just listen. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, it was lovely interviewing you, Josh. I was very happy to actually talk to you in a longer context, just personally, but also learn a bit more about Methodism. I always feel like I was born to be a Methodist like worship leader. I don't know why. Like at some summer camp. Like I just feel like that's my vibe.
Yeah.
So who knows? Maybe that's where I'm predestined to go.
When
Anyway.
the inevitable GMC Anglican communion happens.
Yes.
There we go. We'll make it happen.
We go. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, if you guys haven't already, check out the other 2 episodes. Next we're going to have Reformed, but I hope this was helpful. And again, Josh, you have a channel, Practical Christian Lessons, which is helpful to anyone in the Christian faith. So
and there will be a lot on Wesleyan and Arminian theology there, present and future, and some hopefully Methodist history. There will be a Methodist history playlist, because that is one thing we do have a lot of is historians. So there's plenty of that content already out there.
Yeah,
I can just grab for everybody.
Yeah, and that will be great, because I mean, we have other resources, and I'm sure we'll provide some other ones in the description. But just to have your channel as a resource is very nice. So
and on there you can also get a link to my Discord, where I have threads for tons of different Protestant denominations and tons of resources there that can also be useful.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for watching. Peace be with you, and God bless. We'll see you in the next one.